Section 1 of The Adventures of Johnny Chuck. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. The Adventures of Johnny Chuck by Thornton W. Burgess. Section 1, Chapter 1. Gentle Sister Southwind Arrives. Good news for everyone, above or down below. For Master Winsome Bluebird's come to whistle off the snow. All the Green Meadows and all the Green Forest had heard the news. Peter Rabbit had seen to that, and just as soon as each of the little meadow and forest folks heard it, he hurried out to listen for himself and make sure that it was true. And each, when he heard that sweet voice of Winsome Bluebird, had kicked up his heels and shouted, "Hurrah!" You see, they all knew that Winsome Bluebird never is very far ahead of gentle Sister Southwind, and that when she arrives, blustering, rough Brother North Wind is already on his way back to the cold, cold land where the ice never melts. Of course, Winsome Bluebird doesn't really whistle off the snow, but after he comes, the snow disappears so fast that it seems as if he did. It is surprising what a difference a little good news makes. Of course, nothing had really changed that first day when Winsome Bluebird's whistle was heard on the Green Meadows and in the Green Forest, but it seemed as if everything had changed. And it was all because that sweet whistle was a promise that everyone knew would come true. And so there was joy in all the hearts on the Green Meadows and in the Green Forest. Even grim old Granny Fox felt it. And as for Reddy Fox, why, Reddy even shouted good-naturedly to Peter Rabbit and hoped he was feeling well. And then gentle Sister Southwind arrived. She came in the night, and in the morning there she was, hard at work making the Green Meadows and the Green Forest ready for Mr. Spring. She broke the icy bands that had bound the Smiling Pool and the Laughing Brook so long, and the Smiling Pool began to smile once more, and the Laughing Brook to gurgle, and then to laugh, and finally to sing merrily. She touched the little banks of snow that remained, and straightway they melted and disappeared. She kissed the 8 babies of Unc' Billy Possum, and they kicked off the bedclothes under which old Mrs. Possum had tucked them and scrambled out of the big hollow tree to play. She peeped in at the door of Johnny Chuck and called softly, and Johnny Chuck awoke from his long sleep and yawned and began to think about getting up. She knocked at the door of Digger the Badger, and Digger awoke. She tickled the nose of Striped Chipmunk, who was about half awake, and Striped Chipmunk sneezed, and then he hopped out of bed and hurried up to his doorway to shout good morning after her as she hurried over to see if Bobby Coon was still sleeping. Peter Rabbit followed her about. He couldn't understand it at all. Peter had smiled to himself when he heard how softly she had called at the doorway of Johnny Chuck's house, for many and many a time during the long winter Peter had stopped at Johnny Chuck's house and shouted down the long hall at the top of his voice without once waking Johnny Chuck. Now Peter nearly tumbled over with surprise as he heard Johnny Chuck yawn at the first low call of gentle Sister Southwind. "How does she do it? I don't understand it at all," said Peter, as he scratched his long left ear with his long left hind leg. Gentle Sister Southwind smiled at Peter. "There are a lot of things in this world that you will never understand, Peter Rabbit. You will just have to believe them without understanding them and be content to know that they are so," she said, and hurried over to the Green Forest to tell Unc' Billy Possum that his old friend, Ol' Mistah Buzzard, was on his way up from Old Virginny. Chapter 2. Johnny Chuck Receives Callers. The morning after gentle Sister Southwind arrived on the Green Meadows, Peter Rabbit came hopping and skipping down the Lone Little Path from the Green Forest. Peter was happy. He didn't know why. He just was happy. It was in the air. Everybody else seemed happy too. Peter had to stop every few minutes just to kick up his heels and try to jump over his own shadow. He had felt just that way ever since gentle Sister Southwind arrived. "I simply have to kick and dance. I cannot help but gaily prance. Somehow I feel it in my toes whenever gentle Southwind blows." So sang Peter Rabbit as he hopped and skipped down the Lone Little Path. Suddenly he stopped right in the middle of the verse. He sat up very straight and stared down at Johnny Chuck's house. Someone was sitting on Johnny Chuck's doorstep. It looked like Johnny Chuck. No, it looked like the shadow of Johnny Chuck. Peter rubbed his eyes and looked again. Then he hurried as fast as he could, lipperty-lipperty-lip. The nearer he got, the less like Johnny Chuck looked the one sitting on Johnny Chuck's doorstep. Johnny Chuck had gone to sleep, round and fat and roly-poly, so fat he could hardly waddle. This fellow was thin, even thinner than Peter Rabbit himself. He waved a thin hand to Peter. "Hello, Peter Rabbit! I told you that I would see you in the spring. How did you stand the long winter?" That certainly was Johnny Chuck's voice. Peter was so delighted that in his hurry he fell over his own feet. "Is it really and truly you, Johnny Chuck?" he cried. "Of course it's me. Who did you think it was?" replied Johnny Chuck rather crossly, for Peter was staring at him as if he had never seen him before. I didn't know," confessed Peter Rabbit. "I thought it was you, and I thought it wasn't you. What have you been doing to yourself, Johnny Chuck? Your coat looks 3 sizes too big for you, and when I last saw you, it didn't look big enough." Peter hopped all around Johnny Chuck, looking at him as if he didn't believe his own eyes. "Oh, Johnny's all right. He's just been living on his own fat," said another voice. It was Jimmy Skunk who had spoken, and he now stood holding out his hand to Johnny Chuck and grinning good-naturedly. He had come up without either of the others seeing him. Peter's big eyes opened wider than ever. "Do you mean to say that he has been eating his own fat?" he gasped. Johnny Chuck and Jimmy Skunk both laughed. "No," said Jimmy Skunk, "he didn't eat it, but he lived on it just the same while he was asleep all winter. Don't you see he hasn't got a particle of fat on him now?" "But how could he live on it if he didn't eat it?" asked Peter, staring at Johnny Chuck as if he had never seen him before. Jimmy Skunk shrugged his shoulders. "Don't ask me. That is one of Old Mother Nature's secrets. You'll have to ask her," he replied. "And don't ask me," said Johnny Chuck, "for I've been asleep all the time. My, but I'm hungry." "So am I," said another voice. There was Reddy Fox grinning at them. Johnny Chuck dove into the doorway of his house with Peter Rabbit at his heels, for there was nowhere else to go. Jimmy Skunk just stood still and chuckled. He knew that Reddy Fox didn't dare touch him. Chapter 3. The Singers of the Smiling Pool. Mr. Spring was making everybody happy on the Green Meadows and in the Green Forest and around the Smiling Pool. With her gentle fingers she wakened one by one all the little sleepers who had spent the long winter dreaming of warm summer days and not knowing anything at all of the rough, blustering Brother North Wind or Jack Frost. As they wakened, many began to sing for joy, but the clearest, loudest singers of all lived in the Smiling Pool. It was a long time before Peter Rabbit and Johnny Chuck knew where they lived. Every night, just before going to bed, Johnny Chuck would sit on his doorstep just to listen. And as he listened, somehow he felt better and happier, and he always had pleasant dreams after listening to the sweet singers of the Smiling Pool. Even after he had curled himself up for the night deep down in his snug bedroom, he could hear those sweet voices, and whenever he waked up in the night he would hear them. "Spring, spring, 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 beautiful, beautiful, beautiful spring, so gentle, so loving, so sweet and so fair. Oh, who can be cross when there's love in the air? Be happy, be joyful, and join in our song, and help us to send the glad tidings along. Spring, 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 beautiful, beautiful, beautiful spring." When Johnny Chuck had first heard them, he had looked in all the tree tops for the singers, but not one could he see. Then he thought that they must be hidden in the bushes, but when he went to look, he found that the sweet singers were not there. It was very mysterious. Finally he asked Peter Rabbit if he knew who the sweet singers were and where they were. Peter didn't know, but he was willing to try to find out. Peter is always willing to try to find out about things he doesn't already know about. So Johnny Chuck and Peter Rabbit started out to find the sweet singers.
"I believe they are down in the old bulrushes around the Smiling Pool,"
said Peter Rabbit, as he stood listening with a hand behind one long ear. So over to the Smiling Pool they hurried. The nearer they got, the louder became the voices singing, "Spring, spring, 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 beautiful, beautiful, beautiful spring." But look as they would, they couldn't see a single singer among the brown bulrushes. It was very strange indeed. It seemed as if the voices came right out of the Smiling Pool itself. When Peter Rabbit made a little noise, as he hopped out on the bank where he could look all over the Smiling Pool, the singing stopped. After he had sat perfectly still for a little while, it began again. There was no doubt about it this time. Those voices came right out of the water. Johnny Chuck stared at Peter Rabbit, and Peter stared at Johnny Chuck. Nobody was to be seen in the Smiling Pool, and yet there were those voices, oh, so many of them, coming right out of the water.
"How can birds stay under water and still sing?"
asked Johnny Chuck.
"Ho, ho, ho! Ha, ha, ha!"
Peter Rabbit and Johnny Chuck whirled around to find Jerry Muskrat peeping up at them from a hole in the bank almost under their feet.
"Ho, ho, ho! That's the best joke this spring!" shouted Jerry Muskrat, and laughed until he had to hold his sides. "Birds under water! Ho, ho, ho!"
Chapter 4 Johnny Chuck Finds Out Who the Sweet Singers Are. Johnny Chuck couldn't keep away from the Smiling Pool. No, Sir, Johnny Chuck couldn't keep away from the Smiling Pool. Ever since he and Peter Rabbit had gone over there looking for the sweet singers, who every night and part of the day told all who would listen how glad they were that Mr. Spring had come to the Green Meadows and the Green Forest, Johnny Chuck had had something on his mind, and this is why he couldn't keep away from the Smiling Pool. You see, it was this way. Johnny and Peter had thought that, of course, the sweet singers were birds. They hadn't dreamed of anything else, so of course they went looking for birds. When they reached the Smiling Pool, the voices came right out of the water. Johnny knew that some birds, like many of the cousins of Mrs. Quack, can stay under water a long time, and so he didn't know but some other birds might. Jerry Muskrat was always watching for Johnny whenever he came to the Smiling Pool, and his eyes would twinkle as he would gravely say, "Hello, Johnny Chuck. Have you seen the birds sing under water yet?" Johnny would smile good-naturedly and reply,
"Not yet, Jerry Muskrat. Won't you point them out to me?"
Then Jerry would reply,
"2 eyes you have, bright as can be. Perhaps some day you'll learn to see."
Then Johnny Chuck would sit as still as ever he knew how and watch the Smiling Pool. But not a bird did he see in the water, though the singers were still there. One day a sudden thought popped into his head. Perhaps those singers were not birds at all. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Perhaps it was because he was looking so hard for birds that he hadn't seen anything else. Johnny began to look, not for anything in particular, but to see everything that he could. Almost right away he saw some tiny little dark spots on the water. They didn't look like much of anything. They were so small that he hadn't noticed them before. One of them was quite close to him, and as Johnny Chuck looked at it, it began to look like a tiny nose, and then, why, just then, Johnny was very sure that one of those singing voices came right from that very spot. He was so surprised that he hopped to his feet and excitedly beckoned to Jerry Muskrat. The instant he did that, the voices near him stopped singing, and the little spots in the water disappeared, leaving just the tiniest of little rings. Just such tiny little rings as drops of rain falling on the Smiling Pool would make. And when that tiny spot nearest to him that looked like a tiny nose disappeared, Johnny Chuck caught just a glimpse of a little form under the water.
Why, the singers are Grandfather Frog's children!" cried Johnny Chuck. "No, they're not, but they are cousins to them. They are the grandchildren of old Mr. Tree Toad, and they are called Hylas. said Jerry Muskrat, laughing and rubbing his hands in great glee. "I told you that if you used your eyes, you'd learn to see." "My, but they've got voices bigger than they are," said Johnny Chuck, as he started home across the Green Meadows. "I'm glad I know who the singers of the Smiling Pool are, and I mustn't forget their name. Hylas! What a funny name!" But Farmer Brown's boy, listening to their song that evening, didn't call them Hylas. He said, "Hear the peepers! Spring is surely here!"
Section 1. Section 2 of The Adventures of Johnny Chuck. This recording is in the public domain. The Adventures of Johnny Chuck, by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 5. Johnny Chuck becomes dissatisfied. Johnny Chuck was unhappy. Here it was, the glad springtime, when everybody is supposed to be the very happiest, and Johnny Chuck was unhappy. Why was he unhappy? Well, he hardly knew himself. He had slept comfortably all the long winter. He had awakened very, very hungry, but now he had plenty to eat. All about him the birds were singing or busily at work building new homes, and still Johnny Chuck felt unhappy. It was dreadful to feel this way and not have any good reason for it. One bright morning Johnny Chuck sat on his doorstep watching Drummer the Woodpecker building a new home in the old apple tree. Drummer's red head flew back and forth, and his sharp bill cut out tiny bits of wood. It was slow work. It was hard work, but Drummer seemed happy, very happy indeed. It was watching Drummer that started Johnny Chuck to thinking about his own home. He had always thought it a very nice home. He had built it just as he wanted it. From the doorstep he could look in all directions over the Green Meadows. It had a front door and a hidden back door. Yes, it was a very nice home indeed. But now, all of a sudden, Johnny Chuck became dissatisfied with his home. It was too near the Lone Little Path. Too many people knew where it was. It wasn't big enough. The front door ought to face the other way. Dear me, what a surprising lot of faults a discontented heart can find with things that have always been just right. It was so with Johnny Chuck. That house in which he had spent so many happy days, which had protected him from all harm, of which he had been so proud when he first built it, was now the meanest house in the world. If other people had new houses, why shouldn't he? The more he thought about it, the more dissatisfied and discontented he became and, of course, the more unhappy. You know one cannot be dissatisfied and discontented and happy at the same time. Now, dissatisfied and discontented people are not at all pleasant to have around. Johnny Chuck had always been one of the best-natured of all the little meadow people, and everybody liked him. So Jimmy Skunk didn't know quite what to make of it when he came down the Lone Little Path and found Johnny Chuck so out of sorts that he wouldn't even answer when spoken to. Jimmy Skunk was feeling very good-natured himself. He had just had a fine breakfast of fat beetles, and he was at peace with all the world. So he sat down beside Johnny Chuck and began to talk, just as if Johnny Chuck was his usual good-natured self. "It's a fine day," said Jimmy Skunk. Johnny Chuck just sniffed. "You're looking very fine," said Jimmy. Johnny just scowled. "I think you've got the best place on the Green Meadows for a house," said Jimmy, pretending to admire the view. Johnny scowled harder than ever. "And such a splendid house," said Jimmy. "I wish I had one like it." "I'm glad you like it. You can have the old thing," snapped Johnny Chuck. "What's that?" demanded Jimmy Skunk, opening his eyes very wide. "I said that you can have it. I'm going to move," replied Johnny Chuck. Now, he really hadn't thought of moving until that very minute, and he didn't know why he had said it. But he had said it, and because he is an obstinate little fellow, he stuck to it. "When can I move in?" asked Jimmy Skunk, his eyes twinkling. "Right away, if you want to,"
replied Johnny Chuck, and swaggered off down the Lone Little Path, leaving Jimmy Skunk to stare after him as if he thought Johnny Chuck had suddenly gone crazy, as indeed he did. Chapter 6 Johnny Chuck Turns Tramp. Johnny Chuck had turned tramp. Yes, Sir, Johnny Chuck had turned tramp. It was a funny thing to do, but he had done it. He didn't know why he had done it, excepting that he had become dissatisfied and discontented and unhappy in his old home. And then, almost without thinking what he was doing, he had told Jimmy Skunk that he could have the house he had worked so hard to build the summer before and of which he had been so proud. Then Johnny Chuck had swaggered away down the Lone Little Path without once looking back at the home he was leaving. Where was he going? Well, to tell the truth, Johnny didn't know. He was going to see the world, and perhaps when he had seen the world, he would build him a new house. So as long as he was in sight of Jimmy Skunk, he swaggered along quite as if he was used to traveling about, without any snug house to go to at night. But right down in his heart, Johnny Chuck didn't feel half so bold as he pretended. You see, not since he was a little Chuck and had run away from Old Mother Chuck with Peter Rabbit had he ever been very far from his own doorstep. He had always been content to grow fat and roly-poly right near his own home, and listen to the tales of the Great World from Jimmy Skunk and Peter Rabbit and Bobby Coon and Unc' Billy Possum, all of whom are great travelers. But now, here he was, actually setting forth, and without a home to come back to. You see, he had made up his mind that no matter what happened, he wouldn't come back after having given his house to Jimmy Skunk. When he had reached a place where he thought Jimmy Skunk couldn't see him, Johnny Chuck turned and looked back, and a queer little feeling seemed to make a lump that filled his throat and choked him. The fact is, Johnny Chuck had already begun to feel homesick. But he swallowed very hard and tried to make himself think that he was having a splendid time. He stopped looking back and started on, and as he tramped along, he tried to sing a song he had once heard Jimmy Skunk sing. The world may stretch full far and wide, what matters that to me? I'll tramp it up, I'll tramp it down, for I am bold and free. It was a very brave little song, but Johnny Chuck didn't feel half so brave and bold as he tried to think he did. Already he was beginning to wonder where he would spend the night. Then he thought of old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk, who had given him such a fright and had so nearly caught him when he was a little fellow. The thought made him look around hastily, and there was old Whitetail himself, sailing back and forth hungrily just ahead of him. A great fear took possession of Johnny Chuck, and he made himself as flat as possible in the grass, for there was no place to hide. He made up his mind that anyway he would fight. Near and nearer came old Whitetail. Finally he passed right over Johnny Chuck, but he didn't offer to touch him. Indeed, it seemed to Johnny that old Whitetail actually grinned and winked at him. And right then all his fear left him. "Pooh!" said Johnny Chuck scornfully. "Who's afraid of him?" He suddenly realized that he was no longer a helpless little Chuck who couldn't take care of himself, but big and strong, with sharp teeth with which his old enemy had no mind to make a closer acquaintance, when there were mice and snakes to be caught without fighting. So he puffed out his chest and went on, and actually began to enjoy himself, and almost wished for a chance to show how big and strong he was. Chapter 7 Johnny's First Adventure. After old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk passed Johnny Chuck without offering to touch him, Johnny began to feel very brave and bold and important. He strutted and swaggered along as much as his short legs would let him. He held his head very high. Already he felt that he had had an adventure, and he longed for more. He forgot the terrible lonesome feeling of a little while before. He forgot that he had given away the only home he had. He didn't know just why, but right down deep inside he had a sudden feeling that he really didn't care a thing about that old home. In fact, he felt as if he wouldn't care if he never had another home. Yes, Sir, that is the way that Johnny Chuck felt. Do you know why? just because he had begun to realize how big and strong he really was. Now, it is a splendid thing to feel big and strong and brave, a very splendid thing. But it is a bad thing to let that feeling turn to pride, foolish pride. Of course, old Whitetail hadn't really been afraid of Johnny Chuck. He had simply passed Johnny Chuck with a wink because there was plenty to eat without the trouble of fighting, and Whitetail doesn't fight just for the fun of it. But foolish Johnny Chuck really thought that old Whitetail was afraid of him. The more he thought about it, the more tickled he felt and the more puffed up he felt. He began to talk to himself and to brag. Yes, Sir, Johnny Chuck began to brag.
"I'm not afraid of any one. They're all afraid of me. I only have to show my teeth to make them turn and flee."
"Pooh!" said a voice. "Pooh! It would take two like you to make me run away." Johnny Chuck gave a startled jump. There was a strange Chuck glaring at him from behind a little bunch of grass. He was a big gray old Chuck whom Johnny never had seen on the Green Meadows before, and he didn't look the least bit afraid. No, Sir, he didn't look the teeniest, weeniest bit afraid. Somehow Johnny Chuck didn't feel half so big and strong and brave as he had a few minutes before. But it wouldn't do to let this stranger know it. Of course not. So, though he felt very small inside, Johnny made all his hair bristle up and tried to look very fierce.
"Who are you, and what are you doing on my Green Meadows?" he demanded.
"Your Green Meadows! Your Green Meadows! Ho, ho, ho! Your Green Meadows!" The stranger laughed an unpleasant laugh. "How long since you owned the Green Meadows?" "I have just come down onto them from the Old Pasture, and I like the looks of them so well that I think I will stay. So run along, little boaster. There isn't room for both of us here, and the sooner you trot along, the better." The stranger suddenly showed all his teeth and gritted them unpleasantly. Now, when Johnny Chuck heard this, great anger filled his heart. A stranger had ordered him to leave the Green Meadows where he had been born and always lived. He could hardly believe his own ears. He, Johnny Chuck, would show this stranger who was master here. With a squeal of rage, Johnny sprang at the gray old Chuck. Then began such a fight as the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind had never seen before. They danced around excitedly and cried, "How dreadful!" and hoped that Johnny Chuck would win, for you know they loved him very much. Over and over the two little fighters rolled, biting and scratching and tearing and growling and snarling. Jolly, round, red Mr. Sun hid his face behind a cloud so as not to see such a dreadful sight. The stranger had been in many fights, and he was very crafty. For a while Johnny felt that he was getting the worst of it, and he began to wonder if he really would have to leave the Green Meadows. The very thought filled him with new rage, and he fought harder than ever. Now the stranger was old and his teeth were worn, while Johnny was young and his teeth were very sharp. After a long, long time, Johnny felt the stranger growing weaker. Johnny fought harder than ever. At last the stranger cried, "Enough!" and when he could break away, started back towards the Old Pasture. Johnny Chuck had won. Chapter 8. Johnny has another adventure. Johnny Chuck lay stretched out on the cool, soft grass of the Green Meadows, panting for breath. He was very tired and very sore. His face was scratched and bitten. His clothes were torn, and he smarted dreadfully in a dozen places, but still Johnny Chuck was happy. When he raised his head to look, he could see a gray old Chuck limping off towards the Old Pasture. Once in a while the gray old Chuck would turn his head and show his teeth, but he kept right on towards the Old Pasture. Johnny Chuck smiled. It had been a great fight, and more than once Johnny Chuck had thought that he should have to give up. He thought of this now, and then he thought with shame of how he had bragged and boasted just before the fight. What if he had lost? He resolved that he would never again brag or boast, but he also made up his mind that if any one should pick a quarrel with him, he would show that he wasn't afraid. It was getting late in the afternoon when Johnny finally felt rested enough to go on. He had got to find a place to spend the night. He hobbled along, for he was very stiff and sore, until he came to the edge of the Green Meadows, where they meet the Green Forest. Jolly, round, red Mr. Sun was almost ready to go down to his bed behind the Purple Hills. Shadows were already beginning to creep through the Green Forest. Somehow they gave Johnny Chuck that same lonesome feeling that he had had when he first left his old home. You see, he had always lived out in the Green Meadows, and somehow he was afraid of the Green Forest in the night. So instead of going into the Green Forest, he wandered along the edge of it, looking for a place in which to spend the night. At last he came to a hollow log lying just out on the edge of the Green Meadows. Very carefully Johnny Chuck examined it, to be sure that no one else was using it.
"It's just the place I'm looking for,"
he said aloud. Just then there was a sharp hiss, a very fierce hiss. Johnny Chuck felt the hair on his neck rise as it always did when he heard that hiss, and he wasn't at all surprised when he turned his head to find Mr. Blacksnake close by. Mr. Blacksnake glided swiftly up to the old log and coiled himself in front of the opening. Then he raised his head and ran out his tongue in the most impudent way.
"Run along, Johnny Chuck. I've decided to sleep here myself tonight," he said sharply.
Now when Johnny Chuck was a very little fellow, he had been in great fear of Mr. Blacksnake, as he had had reason to be. And because he didn't know any better, he had been afraid ever since. Mr. Blacksnake knew this, and so now he looked as ugly as he knew how. But you see he didn't know about the great fight that Johnny Chuck had just won. Now to win an honest fight always makes one feel very strong and very sure of oneself. Johnny looked at Mr. Blacksnake and saw that Mr. Blacksnake didn't look half as big as Johnny had always thought he did. He made up his mind that as he had found the old log first, he had the best right to it.
"I found it first, and I'm going to keep it,"
snapped Johnny Chuck, and with every hair on end and gritting his teeth, he walked straight towards Mr. Blacksnake. Now Mr. Blacksnake is a great bluffer, while at heart he is really a coward. With a fierce hiss he rushed right at Johnny Chuck, expecting to see him turn tail and run. But Johnny stood his ground and showed all his sharp teeth. Instead of attacking Johnny, Mr. Blacksnake glided past him and sneaked away through the grass. Johnny Chuck chuckled as he crept into the hollow log.
"Only a coward runs away without fighting," he murmured sleepily.
End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Adventures of Johnny Chuck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Adventures of Johnny Chuck by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 9. Another Strange Chuck. Johnny Chuck awoke just as jolly, round, red Mr. Sun pulled his own nightcap off. At first Johnny couldn't think where he was. He blinked and blinked. Then he rolled over. "Ouch!" cried Johnny Chuck. You see, he was so stiff and sore from his great fight the day before that it hurt to roll over. But when he felt the smart of those wounds, he remembered where he was. He was in the old hollow log that he had found on the edge of the Green Meadows just before dark. It was the first time that Johnny had ever slept anywhere, excepting underground, and as he lay blinking his eyes, it seemed very strange and rather nice, too.
"Well, well, well! What are you doing here?"
cried a sharp voice. Johnny Chuck looked towards the open end of the old log. There, peeping in, was a little face as sharp as the voice.
"Hello, Chatterer!" cried Johnny.
"I say, what are you doing here?"
persisted Chatterer the Red Squirrel, for it was he.
"Just waking up,"
replied Johnny with a grin.
"It's time,"
replied Chatterer.
"but that isn't telling me what you were doing so far from home."
"I haven't any home,"
said Johnny, his face growing just a wee bit wistful.
"You haven't any home?"
Chatterer's voice sounded as if he didn't think he had heard aright.
"What have you done with it?"
"Given it to Jimmy Skunk," replied Johnny Chuck. Now Chatterer never gives anything to anybody, and how any one could give away his home was more than he could understand. He stared at Johnny as if he thought Johnny had gone crazy. Finally he found his tongue.
I don't believe it,
he snapped.
If Jimmy Skunk has got your old home, it's because he put you out of it.
No such thing. I'd like to see Jimmy Skunk or anybody else put me out of my home. Johnny Chuck spoke scornfully. I gave it to him because I didn't want it any longer. I'm going to see the world, and then I'm going to build me a new home. Everybody else seems to be building new homes this spring. Why shouldn't I?
I'm not,
retorted Chatterer.
I know enough to know when I am well off. Who has a discontented heart is sure to play a sorry part.
Johnny Chuck crawled out of the old log and stretched himself somewhat painfully. That may be, but there are different kinds of discontent. Who never looks for better things will live his life in little rings. Well, I must be moving along if I am to see the world. So Johnny Chuck bade Chatterer good-bye and started on. It was very delightful to wander over the Green Meadows on such a beautiful spring morning. The violets and the windflowers nodded to him, and the dandelions smiled up at him. Johnny almost forgot his torn clothes and the bites and scratches of his great fight with the gray old Chuck the day before. It was fun to just go where he pleased and not have a care in the world. He was thinking of this as he sat up to look over the Green Meadows. His heart gave a great throb. What was that over near the lone elm tree? It was? Yes, it certainly was another Chuck. Could it be the old gray Chuck come back for another fight? A great anger filled the heart of Johnny Chuck, and he whistled sharply. The strange Chuck didn't answer. Johnny ground his teeth and started for the lone elm tree. He would show this other Chuck who was master of the Green Meadows. Chapter 10. Why Johnny Chuck Didn't Fight. Anger is an awful thing. It never stops to reason. It boils right over all at once, no matter what the season. It was so with Johnny Chuck. The minute he caught sight of the strange Chuck over by the lone elm tree, anger filled his heart and fairly boiled over, until he was in a terrible rage. Of course it was foolish, very foolish indeed. The strange Chuck hadn't said or done anything to make Johnny Chuck angry, not the least thing in the world, excepting to come down onto the Green Meadows. Now the Green Meadows are very broad, and there is room for many Chucks. It was pure selfishness on the part of Johnny Chuck to want to drive away every other Chuck. But anger never stops to reason. It didn't now. Johnny Chuck hurried as fast as his short legs could take him towards the lone elm tree, and in his mind was just one thought: to drive that strange Chuck off the Green Meadows, and to punish him so that he never, never would dare even think of coming back. So great was Johnny's anger that every hair stood on end, and as he ran he chattered and scolded. "I'll fix him! These are my Green Meadows, and no one else has any business here unless I say so. I'll fix him! I'll fix him!" Then Johnny would grind his teeth, and in his eyes was the ugliest look. He wasn't nice to see, not a bit nice. The Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind didn't know what to make of him. Could this be the Johnny Chuck they had known so long, the good-natured, happy Johnny Chuck whom everybody loved? They drew away from him, for they didn't want anything to do with any one in such a frightful temper. But Johnny Chuck didn't even notice, and if he had, he wouldn't have cared. That is the trouble with anger. It crowds out everything else, when it once fills the heart. When Johnny had first seen the stranger, he had thought right away that it was the old gray Chuck with whom he had had such a terrible fight the day before, and whom he whipped. Perhaps that was one reason for Johnny Chuck's terrible anger now, for the old gray Chuck had tried to drive Johnny Chuck off the Green Meadows. But when he had to stop for breath and sat up to look again, he saw that it wasn't the old gray Chuck at all. It was a younger Chuck, and much smaller than the old gray Chuck. It was smaller than Johnny himself. "It'll be all the easier to whip," muttered Johnny, as he started on again, never once thinking of how unfair it would be to fight with one smaller than himself. That was because he was so angry. Anger never is fair. Pretty soon he reached the lone elm tree. The stranger wasn't to be seen. No, Sir, the stranger wasn't anywhere in sight. Johnny Chuck sat up and looked this way and looked that way, but the stranger was nowhere in sight. "Pooh!" said Johnny Chuck. "He's afraid to fight. He's a coward. But he can't get away from me so easily. He's hiding, and I'll find him, and then—" Johnny didn't finish, but he ground his teeth, and it wasn't a pleasant sound to hear. So Johnny Chuck hunted for the stranger, and the longer he hunted, the angrier he grew. Somehow the stranger managed to keep out of his sight. He was almost ready to give up, when he almost stumbled over the stranger, hiding in a little clump of bushes. And then a funny thing happened. What do you think it was? Why, all the anger left Johnny Chuck. His hair no longer stood on end. He didn't know why, but all of a sudden he felt foolish, very foolish indeed. "Who are you?" he demanded gruffly. I'm Polly Chuck," replied the stranger in a small, timid voice.
Chapter 11. The Greatest Thing in the World. Johnny Chuck had begun to think about his clothes. Yes, sir, he spent a whole lot of time thinking about how he looked and wishing that he had a handsomer coat. For the first time in all his life he began to envy Reddy Fox because of the beautiful red coat of which Reddy is so proud. It seemed to Johnny that his own coat was so plain and so dull that no one would look at it twice. Besides, it was torn now because of the great fight Johnny had had with the old gray Chuck who came down from the Old Pasture. Johnny smoothed it down and brushed it carefully, and tried to make himself look as spick and span as he knew how.
"Oh, dear," he sighed. "I don't see why Old Mother Nature didn't give me as handsome a coat as she did Reddy Fox. And there are Jimmy Skunk and Happy Jack the Gray Squirrel why, almost everyone has a handsomer coat than I have."
Now this wasn't at all like Johnny Chuck. First he had been discontented with his house and had given it to Jimmy Skunk. Now he was discontented with his clothes. What was coming over Johnny Chuck? He really didn't know himself. At least, he wouldn't have admitted that he knew. But right down deep in his heart was a great desire. The desire to have Polly Chuck admire him. Yes, sir, that is what it was. And it seemed to him that she would admire him a great deal more if he wore fine clothes. You see, he hadn't learned yet what Peter Rabbit had learned a long time ago, which is that fine clothes but catch the passing eye. Fine deeds win love from low and high. So Johnny Chuck wished and wished that he had had a handsome suit. But as he didn't, and no amount of wishing would bring him one, he just made the one he did have look as good as he could, and then went in search of Polly Chuck. Sometimes she would not notice him at all. Sometimes he would find her shyly peeping at him from behind a clump of grass. Then Johnny Chuck would try to make himself look very important, and would strut about as if he really did own the Green Meadows. Sometimes she would hide from him, and when he found her, she would run away. Other times she would be just as nice to him as she could be, and they would have a jolly time hunting for sweet clover and other nice things to eat. Then Johnny Chuck's heart would swell until it seemed to him that it would fairly burst with happiness. Instead of wanting to drive Polly Chuck away from the Green Meadows, as he had the old gray Chuck, Johnny began to worry for fear that Polly Chuck might not stay on the Green Meadows. Whenever he thought of that, his heart would sink way, way down, and he would hurry to look for her and make sure that she was still there. When he was beside her, he felt very big and strong and brave and longed for a chance to show her how brave he was. She was such a timid little thing herself that the least little thing frightened her, and Johnny Chuck was glad that this was so, for it gave him a chance to protect her. When he wasn't with her, he spent his time looking for new patches of sweet clover to take her to. At first she wouldn't go without a great deal of coaxing,
but after a while he didn't have to coax at all. She seemed to delight to be with him as much as he did to be with her. So Johnny Chuck grew happier and happier. He was happier than he had ever been in all his life before. You see, Johnny Chuck had found the greatest thing in the world. Do you know what it is? It is called love.
Chapter 12.
Johnny Chuck proves his love. These spring days were beautiful days on the Green Meadows. It seemed to Johnny Chuck that the Green Meadows never had been so lovely or the songs of the birds so sweet. He had forgotten all about his old friends, Jimmy Skunk and Peter Rabbit, and the other little meadow people. You see, he couldn't think of anybody but Polly Chuck, and he didn't want to be with anybody but Polly Chuck. He had even forgotten that he had started out to see the world. He didn't care anything more about the world. All he wanted was to be where Polly Chuck was. Then he was perfectly happy. That was because Johnny Chuck had found the greatest thing in the world, which is love. But Johnny still had one great wish, the wish that he might show Polly Chuck just how brave and strong he was, and how well he could take care of her. One morning they were feasting in a patch of sweet clover over near an old stone wall. It was the same stone wall in which Johnny Chuck had escaped from old Whitetail the Marsh Hawk when Johnny was a very little fellow. Suddenly Polly gave a little scream of fright. Johnny Chuck looked up to see a dog almost upon her. Johnny's first thought was to run to the old stone wall. He was nearer to it than Polly was. Then he saw that that dreadful dog would catch Polly before she could reach the stone wall. A great rage filled Johnny's heart, just as it had when he had fought the old gray Chuck. Every hair stood on end, not with fear, but with anger, and he sprang in front of Polly.
"Run, Polly, run!"
he cried, and Polly ran. But Johnny didn't run. Oh, my, no, Johnny didn't run. He drew himself together ready to spring. He showed all his sharp teeth and ground them savagely. Little sparks of fire seemed to snap out of his eyes. There was no sign of fear in Johnny Chuck then, not the least little bit. Just in front of him the dog stopped and barked. He was a little dog, a young and foolish dog, and he was terribly excited. He barked until he almost lost his breath. He didn't like the looks of Johnny Chuck's sharp teeth, so he circled around Johnny, trying to get behind him. But Johnny turned as the dog circled, and always the little dog found those sharp teeth directly in front of him. He barked and barked until it seemed as if he would bark his head off. Finally the little dog, who was young and foolish, grew tired of just dancing around and barking. "Pooh!" he said to himself. "He's nothing but a Chuck." Then he stopped barking and sprang straight at Johnny with an ugly growl.
Johnny Chuck was ready for him, and he was quicker than the little dog.
His sharp teeth closed on one of the little dog's ears, and he held on while with his stout claws he scratched and tore. The little dog, who was young and foolish and hadn't yet learned how to fight, couldn't get hold of Johnny Chuck anywhere. Then he tried to shake Johnny Chuck off, but he couldn't, because Johnny held on to that ear with his sharp teeth. "Ki-yi-yi-yi!" yelled the little dog, for those teeth hurt dreadfully. "Ki-yi-yi-yi!" Over and over they rolled and tumbled, the little dog trying to get away, and Johnny Chuck holding on to the little dog's ear. Finally Johnny had to let go to get his breath. The little dog sprang to his feet and started for home across the Green Meadows as fast as he could run. Johnny Chuck shook himself and grinned as he had heard the little dog's ki-yi-yi grow fainter and fainter.
"I'm glad it wasn't Bowser the Hound,"
muttered Johnny Chuck as he started towards the old stone wall. There he found Polly Chuck peeping out at him, and all of a tremble with fright. "My, how brave you are!" said Polly Chuck.
"Pooh, that's nothing,"
replied Johnny Chuck. End of section 3.